Okay.
I listen and watch so many things on demand. So I also welcome everyone who's joining us live. But for people on the recording, the nice thing about this topic that you chose, Sarah, is that it's an evergreen topic. People can listen to this Hanukkah time, next Purim, anytime on the calendar. And podcasting is just, it's an industry that does evolve, it changes. But the idea of launching, producing, that, that's an evergreen topic, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And um, all right, before we dive in, I'd love for you to introduce yourself rather than me scrambling to do a good job of it. You go for it.
Right, right. Okay. So, I, my name is Heather Dean, and I'm a very long time producer, public speaker, media interview consultant, and author. I produce and host a podcast called 613 Books. It's a weekly interview program where the audience comprises a variety of readers, book enthusiasts who appreciate books with authentic Jewish values. And when I'm not recording my podcast, I strategize with entrepreneurs and authors who want to earn free media coverage for their product or their service or their written work. So there's that. Plus, I also coach budding podcasters who want
This is
to
why I
develop a
couldn't
large
introduce you.
market. All these things, all these hats we wear. Same with you, my dear. When you wear a lot of hats. But I saw on your Facebook page there are people who are really passionate about this topic who want to get it going. So I do coach them also if they are a newcomer podcaster about how to develop, launch, and market their own podcast too. Would you
Great.
like to
And I
know
would,
how I got here?
yes.
How did I get here? I didn't just pull this career out of my hat. It's
I
basically
mean,
my
I
one.
know from the one time that I met you, but tell everyone else.
Okay, so that was nice of you to come to Jerusalem that day. It was so fun to meet you. It was a beautiful weather day, and I met a lot of our colleagues that day. It was really, really nice. But how did I get here? I, so I had a 14-year career, very exciting career, right out of college, where that career I interviewed like hundreds of celebrities over the course of 14 years for MTV and then E Entertainment Television and also the Associated Press Radio Network, which is the largest radio network in the world because it's a news service. Also, a variety of international publications. So walking away from this career, like why on earth would a glamour girl with a glamorous job do that? So that's why I became an author of a memoir, and that memoir is called Searching for Heather Dean, My Extraordinary Career as a Celebrity Interviewer and Why I Walked Away from It. And the punchline is, the giveaway is that's to have the conversation today. Hooray! That's why I walked away from it.
Okay, awesome. All right, so let's get started. I want to just ask as a general question,
Yeah.
if someone is trying to figure out if podcasting is for them, is it going to help them professionally, or is it just another thing that they're going to add to their lists of shoulds? So how do they figure that out?
Well, this is a perfect question coming from you because the Facebook group that you launched is all about getting exposure, right? So it's something that I also gave a lot of thought. And podcasting is one way to gain a lot of exposure for your brand, for your product, for your service. So podcasting, first and foremost, in my mind, it gives the person a flair of authority. So if somebody is a graphic designer and they want to produce and host their own podcast about graphic design and perhaps have a little piece of news about the latest trends in graphic design, interview other designers, um, have a live show, whatever it is. But if they want it to be on that topic, because that's their topic, that's their own career, it gives them an air of authority because they are hosting a podcast on this topic. It's their show. And while you're at it, it also gives them visibility. So it's not just another graphic designer who's holed up at her desk, at her drafting table, and creating fantastic graphic designs, it also gives her some visibility where people would think, oh, I need to redo my shop. Who can redesign the interior of this shop? Because I just a very good friend of mine actually redesigned a shop that's in one of the big hotels in Jerusalem. So she just did the whole interior for that, and then the graphic design is not interior design, but graphic design. People would, if that's your podcast, they will see you as one of the go-to people because you've increased your visibility by having a podcast. There's other kind of podcasts out there. So let's say it's somebody who has a favorite sport. If they do a podcast that's all about horse racing. So again, that is replete with different ideas. And in the world of horse racing, it's such an old time kind of sport. And so this is a way to kick it up and make it a little bit more modern. And so you, as the horse racing expert, increase your visibility, increase your authority that way. And then I would say the other main thing about gaining exposure, the topic of this program, is being consistent about it. So that means not skipping the month of June. Okay.
It was a mistake.
I wonder if you skipped the month of June. Maybe you actually did have a session. Who knows? It's something to go back and look up. But consistency is also good. It's just very, very helpful for your brand. And again, great way to have exposure because you are the monthly person or the weekly person, or if it's a news podcast, you're the daily person who has the latest on that area of expertise.
Yeah, so I think what I'd add to that is that you really like, because I love the phrase "don't should on yourself" and don't let anyone else should on you either. I don't know who first said it. I've had lots of people say it. So that's I think that's the thing with this, is to be very honest with yourself, on like really actually connect with how it makes you feel when you think about doing a podcast. Does the idea of it make you feel like and you can't breathe and you feel sick and or does it excite you? You know, the same with opening up a Facebook group or having a broadcast channel, all of these different things. Does it just feel like a burden, or does it feel exciting and you've got all these ideas and you can't wait to run with it all? So I think that's really important if you're thinking of doing it but you've been holding back. You know, that could be the reason why, because you just don't have the bandwidth. Like at the moment, I have 0 children at home. Towards the end of the month, I have 1 kid at home. I have a lot of time on my hands. But it didn't used to be like that. I had 4 children to deal with, and I didn't have the time for it. So I think that's just a really important, just to be honest with yourself about, you know, before you launch into this whole thing, do you have the time for this? I know that we all have the same 24 hours in the day, but they're split differently. So I want to move on to talking about, I think a lot of people get very stuck on how to actually how to produce the podcast. What, you know, what's my graphic going to be? What's the title going to be? And do I have to have like, what do I do for my intro and my outro? And do I have to have a cute little catchphrase? And how do I find the guests? So all of the ins and outs of it, what would you say, you know, like where do they begin to like wade through all of that?
So important. These are great questions, which is why you see me occasionally looking off to the side, because I do have some notes. I have so much to say about everything you've talked about. So that's why my notes keep me centered, even though I look off to the side to make sure that I get all this information downloaded to you. And I do want to acknowledge what you said about when there are people who are depending on you at home. That's also a very, very big deal. And maybe you do need to put that idea on the shelf until you're less held responsible for the people that are depending on you. So I got into podcasting in 2016 when already my children were older, big kids, and I still have and had family responsibilities, but had they been still younger, in like young Beit Sefer age, elementary school age, it wouldn't have occurred to me to do it. So yeah, you have to know that if you are going to consistently do this, you really need to carve out the time. And time is also an important thing. So do you want your podcast, your topic, is this going to be a 10-minute podcast or an hour-long podcast? The research that my team did when I first started podcasting was the sweet spot, at least back in 2016, was 22 minutes. 22 minutes, if you think about it, that's like kind of the average time people have for commuting, or around the average time people are going to be on the treadmill, give or take. There are, it's actually a great number to go with. When I was submitting podcasts to Age.com for several years, the editor made very clear the podcast should only be 10 minutes long. Even 9 minutes is pushing it, because that was that particular audience that they were dealing with, is the really people on the go that just had a few minutes here and there to do that. And then there's some people who love a deep dive podcast, and they will sit down and hunker down with an hour-long podcast. That is a very specific kind of audience that is there, but again, it takes a lot of thought. So first and foremost, think of who your target audience is with this topic that you're very passionate about. It's a topic you can speak a lot about, that if you're going to have this podcast as, let's say, a limited run of 6 weeks or a limited run of 6 months, that's one thing. But if you're in it for the long haul, so the podcast that I do right now is about books, right? So that's the sort of thing that when you're passionate about it, you can just go on and on for a very long time until you're ready to go into your next project. So there's that. It's something to be consistent with. You know your target audience, or you have a pretty good idea. You also have to decide, is your podcast going to be something that you do on your own, like Sarah Raanan or Heather Dean, or are you going to have a co-host? There are many podcasts that actually started out as co-hosts, and then just be very clear. People were tuning in for like the one bigger personality, and that sort of shifted into the one big personality, making it their podcast. So, but there are advantages to having co-hosts. It's just that you have to also know what your audience is going to want to deal with. If somebody is the bigger personality, or yeah, there's a lot to weigh. So I don't want to spend too much time on that, because
What would you say also
yeah.
about how to find guests? Because I know that there are Facebook groups where you can find guests, but like,
Right.
what would you say about like making sure that they're the right guests for you, good quality?
Right. Okay. So with guests, that is assuming that your podcast will be one that includes guests. There are some
Mm.
very successful podcasts out there where the person who is the expert, they don't need guests, they don't have guests, and it's a really, really great podcast even without guests. So a lot of people on this group know who Rebecca Saltzman is. She doesn't podcast so much anymore, but she's an expert in home organization. And I don't have a passion for home organization the way she does, but she did an amazing podcast where she spoke very well to the microphone and had a lot to say. And Debbie Sasson has a popular podcast that she's been doing a while now, and she is an expert on money and wealth, and she doesn't really have guests so much. She can hold a podcast on her own. But I hear what you're saying about doing about getting guests to sign on, because that's something that one second, that's something that I also enjoy. I've been an interviewer since I was in my single digit years. Back when my brothers and I used to do like sketch comedy things, I was always the interviewer. They were the crazy characters. So it was always something natural to me. And
Well, let's say someone wants to find a guest, right? So where would you tell them? Where would you tell them to start?
Okay, so a good way to start is, if these are one good way to start is just crowdsourcing, by going on your socials and say that you are working on a podcast on this topic. Who do you think would make great guests? Already you're solving two issues. One is getting guests to pitch, but the other is now you're creating a bit of a buzz, a bit of a stir. She's like, oh wow, I can't wait to tune in. I'm so excited for when it's going to launch, because that's a great topic, or you're the right person to do it. So crowdsourcing is really good. The other thing, meanwhile, that you should be doing is crafting a pitch letter. So if you are going to reach out to potential guests, that is a whole art form itself. It's something I help people a lot with, is crafting a good pitch letter.
Right.
somebody who
Yeah,
worked
I'm
in,
glad you mentioned that because I've seen someone's pitch letter
right,
that
right,
got her some incredible guests, and
right.
they really need to stand out. It can't be done with AI. Well, it could, but it's not going to be the same. And that there are templates that you can get, but everyone uses them, so it really needs to be unique. It can't just be like, I love listening to your podcast about insert episode that you listen to 5 minutes of. Like you can smell it. You can
You
smell
can
it, and
totally
you
do it.
have to
Yeah.
be authentic with it.
Yeah. So this is
Um,
an area where people definitely ask me to consult because working in the entertainment business as I did, I've seen how it's done amazing by the publicists at Warner Brothers and Universal and Paramount and Disney. They do the most amazing pitch letters. So I learned a lot for a lot of years how it's done well. And then, as you know, as you've experienced as a podcaster, I've been on the receiving end of very nice pitch letters and a lot of amateurish pitch letters. A lot of them, and this is like a golden nugget you should take under consideration for people who are watching and listening, is that do not make the host or producer of the podcast do the legwork for you. Do not do it. Do not do that high-level podcast. I'd like to speak about my whatever product or service, and then you just leave a link. Excuse me, Sarah, do you like the idea of someone telling you click on my link and see if I'm a good fit? No. You want somebody who has at least listened to or watched the podcast or knows if it's already launched or has reasons, like they've done a little bit of legwork of this is why I'm a good fit for your podcast. Maybe even include a few bullet point topics of what you are prepared to talk about on
I was going
the
to say,
host.
like, give some titles, like, come up with a few, like, everyone has like topics that they repeat. Like, I've got like a Trello board with like, I recently wrote out 6 or 7 things I want to drive home to my audience. And
Mm-hmm.
based on that, if you just sit down and write down your 6 things, based on that, you can
Yep.
say, here's what I can talk about.
Yes.
Now, I
Yes.
have to say before I forget, it's a question that's come up. Someone asked me this yesterday, and Malcolm in the chat has just basically said the same thing.
Yeah.
Does a podcast have to be built on an existing involved audience? I love being in conversations with people, much rather podcast than post to platforms like LinkedIn, Facebook. But can it work if I
Great.
haven't already built an audience
Yes.
or a
Great.
community on those platforms
So,
and no
okay.
email list either?
Okay, so Malka and I are friends on social media, and she does something that is it's general and yet it's specific, which is great. So before I launched the podcast that I do now, I also wanted to know if there is an audience out there. And you know how I wanted to know is it being done yet? So if it's somebody that, let's say that somebody is a medical doctor that also wants to do a podcast. So if you're going to do a podcast called the Medicine Podcast, good luck. It's too general. Go for something specific. So it might be in your general area, if people are interested in that. If it's somebody who's in the medical field, but they deal with hospital administration. So it's a very niche audience. But for people that are in the medical field, you might find that you have the audience and it's the go-to place that's all about hospital administration.
Right, but I
Um,
think there's a step missing there,
right.
which is I think what Malcolm's asking, which is I'm starting this podcast. I have
Right.
0 followers, and I
Ah,
don't have
okay.
a big audience
Ah,
on
fine,
social
fine,
media,
fine.
and I don't have a mailing list. So am I just screaming into the void? Am I talking to
Right,
myself? How
right,
do I bring people to this? Because it's not like iTunes are going to say, "Oh, look, here's a new and exciting." It takes a lot more than that.
right,
So
right.
am I
Great.
doing it backwards by building the podcast first and then bringing the people?
So one thing is, Malka, and anyone else, you're in the right place because this particular Facebook group is about growing your visibility. And so that is something that you will need to do to get an audience because as I'm sure Sarah has talked about, the whole trust factors. So for somebody to tune into your podcast or engage in any way with your product, service, or written work, whatever it is, It's more helpful if they know who you are, if they like who you are, and if they trust who you are. So this is something where your Malka and anyone else is going to be working on, is like, how do people get to know me? And and then of course they're going to like you, one hopes, and like you enough to engage with your online presence. And yeah, and then do they trust you? Are you really the go-to source for your particular niche, for your particular expertise? So one way of audiences getting to know you as you build your socials is to appear on other people's podcasts. So Malka did a very smart thing. She can add to her media page on her website, is that she actually appeared on my podcast, and not as an author, but I have a little segment that's called What's on My Reading Table. So Malka did a segment, and I invite other people who are watching and listening to this recording or live feed, that she did a segment on What's on My Reading Table, because I have a books podcast. So book readers and book buyers, they love to know, what are you reading? Read any good books lately? So this is one way of getting on someone's podcast, so just so that people get to know who you are. And so that's going to involve some of your reaching out to other people in your field or other podcasters, to also strategize and get known in that way. And it
So
doesn't have to be just.
I guess what like you're saying is it's okay to launch the podcast and start the podcast if your audience is small, and then you have to like get busy building it. And there are different ways of doing that.
Yes. If your podcast does not have a high overhead, then yes. And you know what else is good about it is that you can make all your mistakes early on and you don't have such a big audience. It's like,
Yes,
I am
I
never
agree.
going.
And I've seen people do that on YouTube. Some people
Yes.
who are huge today, they started out, they weren't that good,
Yes.
but practice,
Right.
practice, practice, practice,
Yes.
while not
Yes.
too many people are listening. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, there are so many other questions. I have like so many things buzzing around my head, but I'm trying not to
Okay.
like keep us here all day.
Okay.
So yeah, so we're saying like before, I've seen people do this very elegantly before an episode drops.
Yeah.
They put, you know, however big their social media following is, letting people know about it
Yeah.
through social media if they have a mailing list. The thing I've seen work really nicely on social media, and obviously if you have a bigger audience, it's more impactful. But someone gives a really interesting, like someone put out a post and she said like, this particular way of creating a carousel on Instagram worked really well for one of my clients. I mean, she bigged it up and said it got her fortunes or whatever. I don't like to do that. I like to just say, you know, this worked nicely, whatever. This was successful.
Good.
And here's how you can do it. Like, drop the word, whatever it was, and I'm going to send you like the Canva template of the carousel. And if you'd really like the walkthrough, write blah blah, and I'll link to the podcast where I walk you through it. And it's really interesting because that's what she does with it. That's how she uses her podcasts. She doesn't do it in a traditional way. Her podcasts are basically always connected to something to do with an Instagram post or a newsletter where she expands out more, because you've got 2,200 characters to express yourself. It isn't all that much. So in this podcast, you get to like a much, and she kept it around 20 minutes. And halfway through, she was like, we're halfway through, stay with me.
Right.
But it was really
Right.
interesting. So it really made me start thinking, okay, you don't have to use it in the same way as everyone else. You can just
Right.
really think outside of the box with it.
Right, right. Yes, I've seen that done also, where people will walk their guest through a session. It's like having your episode is a session of whatever your expertise is. It works for that occasionally, if that's what you are putting yourself out there to do. Sometimes things are more. If it's a news podcast, so that's not like a consultation, or if it's a discussion kind of podcast, or a podcast for certain kinds of enthusiasts. So again, in my case,
Yeah, I'm just thinking like selfishly, like if I was going to start one, that's probably what I would use it for, being able to expand out.
Right, right. So at the very least, what you can do is you can do a segment, see how the segment of it goes within your bigger whatever content you're putting out there. Just in case you're a little bit skittish about getting started with that. I also just want to acknowledge Kim asked a great question in the chat. This particular session that I was invited to do is really about the production end as far as the creative end. And Kim was asking some really good technical questions in the chat. So you can follow up with me later about that, about tech stuff. But as far as like production, there's already like a myriad things that we can talk about, and
Yeah.
you know, like Sarah had brought up, do you have a tagline or a mission statement, or what do you say within every episode? So that's also very, very important, is to have some sort, you know, you figured out your target audience, you know whether it's going to be a solo podcast or with co-host, and then your signature. So which is sort of like your mainstay when you introduce the podcast, and then you do the intro, and then you do the outro, which just means you're ending the podcast, you're wrapping it up, and thanking the audience. So it does actually help to know what your mission statement is that you're going to tell the audience, very, very short and concise. So I am a regular fan of certain podcasts on Wall Street Journal. Okay, like there's many outlets out there, but Wall Street Journal is one of my daily go-tos, and they have an investigative news show on a daily basis, and it's called The Journal. So The Journal introduces itself as, I'm so-and-so host, and you're listening to The Journal on Wall Street Journal podcast, where we cover stories about money, business, and power. Delicious, because some days it's going to be more about Washington, D.C., and other days it's going to be about a corporate scandal, and other days it's going to be about executives and CEOs. And it's like, it's still all about money, business, and power. So Wall Street Journal, they nailed that one. And in my own case, so it took me a while to come up with what's my mission statement for the program. And so I introduce myself, I say the name of the program, and then I just say, if you like to read a variety of books with authentic Jewish values, we read you loud and clear. So not bad. So it does help to have that, and then you have your sign on, your sign off.
Right. I think also, like, people get very worried about, do I have to have a jingle? I mean, I got very bogged down in this when I made I created a course for Instagram in 2020, and I was obsessed. I had to have, you know, we talk about intro and outro. I had to have music, and I would say, like, personally, like, from how crazy I drive myself, don't overcomplicate it. Yeah, it is really nice, but like I made it way too complicated.
I hear what you're saying. I think it's important, though. I don't want to discount the importance of music.
It is. So it is for sure, but I spent too long on it.
It takes a long time to find that right piece of music. There are.
Forgive myself then.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Like, so listen, you're talking to someone who used to work at MTV, who knows all the importance of having something that is catchy, and it adds to the memorability of your show. So with the podcast, so I would urge the listeners and watchers of this session to check out any number of royalty-free music platforms. So royalty-free means you don't have to pay for that music excerpt. And the other nice, and why do they do that? Why would musicians even put their stuff on a royalty-free? That's about to get paid. Well, they also get something from it, because their piece of music will hopefully be attached to some sort of production, a podcast, a movie, a television show. They're okay with that. So there's some really awful royalty-free instrumental music out there for podcasts, but there's some good ones. So I also, my senior producer would send me samples, or I would look up some samples, and it would take me at least an hour to get the right sample that will also reflect the mood of
exactly
the show.
It has to match the vibe of the show.
Yes. If it's going to be bouncy, is it going to be metal? Is it going to be like another news show? Like, there's a lot of things, a lot of components. So music actually is important. It can be catchy.
So I want to just backtrack a little bit when we're talking about how to finding potential listeners, growing audience, because like I recently gave a workshop and one of the things I talked about was growing your audience. And I
Right.
think that it's been simplified way too much. It's like, create content with value and be authentic and blah, blah, blah. It's like build it and they will come. And it's just not as easy as that. Like
Right. Right.
having a podcast doesn't mean that you're going to have the audience and the listeners. So you talked about, things to do, like being a guest on someone else's podcast, but just to recap, like were there any other things that you said
Yes.
that would
Yes.
yes.
Yes. Well, there's another thing I would suggest. So let's say that you're I think one of the best things you could do with a podcast to create instant visibility is to attach your podcast to an already existing platform. So if somebody has a podcast about news from the religious world or something, so it could be let's think of something even more specific. Okay, let's say that somebody is a cookbook author or a caterer, right? But let's stick with a cookbook author. So there are many existing outlets out there that are a go-to place for the world of cookery and recipes. The big one is probably Martha Stewart, but there are smaller outlets. But the reason I mention Martha Stewart is because there's all kinds of content on her website, and it's not just Martha that contributes it. You can get recipe tutorials from many contributors that are within her stable, which is a horse term, but it's still within her network, her group. So her people, her tribe. So for anybody who it can get to that level of being somebody who develops recipes and to be on that kind of a platform is awesome. But there are others. There are others that are that already exist. And so if you have something where you have sample episodes, whether they've aired or not, it's probably helpful if they have aired, but even if they've not aired, it's sort of like when a model has her portfolio, her book of all of her composites, whatever it is, or his composites. And then they're able to go and see if there's an agent that wants to take them on. So if you have some samples, same thing with a literary agent, they want to see samples of your writing or what is the book that you're publishing. So you already have some samples. So it could be a bigger outlet will take you on. Like, this is great. This is a perfect fit for why we want. And you might be thinking, why would a bigger outlet want to take little old me who's never done a thing in their life? So you know why? Because the big outlet also wants to be the one associated with the next big thing, right? So so you never know if that's going to be you. So in the case of like in the literary world, J.K. Rowling famously was turned down by many literary agents and republishers until I think it was Warner Books that I don't remember, but who took her on. They get all the credit for finding the next big thing. So it could be in your podcast. You could attach yourself to a platform, even if the platform has 0 podcasts. You might be the first. So I've certainly done this where in the case of when I was in the case of age.com, again, where I sent podcasts for 3 years, they had 0 weekly podcasts. So it was enough that in my whole pitch, which is, again, you can find out more about it if you want to take a discovery call with me, but it was convincing enough that the editor-in-chief said, in general, I'd like to see how it goes. And it went for a very long time until I just stopped sending them podcasts because COVID came along and my family needed me. So more than I needed the podcast.
I
So
think also, like, as you were talking, I was thinking, like,
yeah.
another thing that we didn't touch on is the whole world of SEO and having a podcast out there with keywords in it, and right, like that is just another way to, it depends where you want to send people, but let's say in my case, I have a blog on Medium. I've neglected it recently, but
Good.
I want to get back into it. And let's say I had a podcast, I could
For
talk
people
about something and then say something like, to delve into this more, listen to this podcast. Like, you can do so much with that link to the episode, it
yes,
can go in
yes.
so many places.
Right. So people who don't know what Medium is, look, it's worthwhile to take just a second, look it up. And then you're going to be there for more than a second because it's
Yeah.
really, really compelling what's there. Yeah. So there's Medium, and there are other ways to really make a ripple effect with your podcast.
Yeah,
But
so it's just like having a list of all these different, okay, I'm creating the podcast, but where is it going to go? How am I going, what are all the different ways I'm going to promote it that feel
mhm.
realistic for me? And actually having that as a checklist so that you don't forget, like, because I forgot Medium wasn't on my checklist and I forgot that I was doing that.
Okay. Okay. So this is where, when it comes to SEO and when it comes to other types of marketing, so again, you have your podcast, you have the topic that you're very passionate about. When it comes to SEO and you're ready to spread the word, you may want to think out of the box a bit, like who else, what other kind of niche, what other kind of demographic is going to be interested in your podcast that's not necessarily in that tribe. So again, if you're a recipe developer, you don't want to just reach out to other foodies and recipe developers and whatever. You also want to reach out to busy moms and busy dads and in the Jewish world, the Jewish calendar is replete with holidays where we are obsessing over menus. So, when you're doing the SEO, when you're doing your outreach, reach out to demographics beyond what you think are typical listeners.
And then also, I don't know if this is going to take ages to answer. If it is, then don't answer it. But one thing I was wondering is like, when people say, find us now on Apple Podcasts or iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts. So is it once you've like hosted it on Apple, is it a big pain to then like is it difficult to get it hosted on other platforms, Spotify?
Okay. So this is a bit technical, so I promise
Yeah,
you I will
I
not talk
wasn't
about this.
sure.
I will not talk about this for a year, believe me. You want to get on an RSS feed. I forgot what RSS means, but
Yeah, I don't
RSS,
remember.
everybody knows what SoundCloud is, right? It's not my favorite one, but I'm on it. But once you have your RSS feed, then they cast the net for you. So it's on your main feed, the network, and then it goes out to other channels. So what I have noticed is that just by virtue, and also SoundCloud, for all its flaws, it keeps really good analytics. So I like it for. So you know that which episodes have a good audience size. I mean, all of them have analytics, except for Google. Google Podcasts and Google Analytics. If you haven't gotten your alert, it's what is going on with Google.
But
However,
hold
what's
on one
really
sec.
good,
Let me just
yeah,
understand. If you
yeah,
put your audio onto SoundCloud,
yes.
do people have to
It
subscribe to that the
Mm,
same way you would
no,
subscribe?
no,
So
nope.
why would I want to do that?
Because it is the main. It's sort of like the FCC. No, it's not the FCC. It's just the main conglomerate that has the tentacles. So you could put it out on Apple, but I don't know that necessarily it's going to then have tentacles out to everything else. When you have it on your RSS feed, so for example, my podcast has been on platforms I didn't even know existed because
What are you saying?
it
Because it's
was,
easy to embed it?
I guess so. Now that I would have to ask my senior producer about
It could
the
be.
embedding
Okay.
part of it. Yeah, that's one thing I do outsource, thank God, by someone who has run one of the most giant networks of podcasting in a different country. So that was a great find. But anyway, once you're on a decent RSS feed, it'll get picked up elsewhere.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, I hadn't thought of it in that way. And Marcus asking beyond the scope of now, but why Medium and not Substack? Because I'd heard of Medium before I heard of Substack.
Right,
So now I'm
right.
like, oh, and now there's Substack. So now I really am. I
And
mean, to expand on, yes, I need to get back onto
right,
Medium.
right.
And
So
now I'm like, do I want to go back to Medium or do I want to start again on Substack? I don't
right.
know.
Okay, so Substack is fantastic. I love their content. Substack came a little bit later onto the podcast space. the thing about Substack, remember how we were talking before about Apple and you were talking before about Instagram being like very exclusive, right? So with
It was
Substack,
before anyone was in the room.
before we started this expert session. So with Substack, yeah, you could do Substack podcasts. However, your analytics, from what I've heard, it's a bit trickier because you won't find analytics. I have been told on all
Right,
of
but
your
like just as a
on all of
way
your,
to another channel to let people
yeah,
know, like to
yeah,
link to it. Like what I was saying, like in
yeah,
Medium, I will very often link to a freebie that gets people onto
right,
my email list because that's my aim.
right,
So I'm writing
right,
on Medium, and at some point in the article, I will have a link to, if you want, here's a download where you can learn how to create 300 pieces of content in an hour. Do you want that? Click here, blah. And
right,
then
yeah,
they
yeah,
come, they're in, I've got them in my world for as long as they want to stay in my world. They're not just randomly floating around on Medium. So
yeah,
I view Substack in the same way. And for
yes,
anyone who doesn't know what Substack is, I kind of do recommend that you check it out, but don't blame me
yes,
if you get stuck down 10 rabbit holes.
right.
It is a fascinating place.
Outstanding. And also, so Substack started as a writers clearinghouse, and because the founders of Substack, I've even listened to interviews that he's done, the main founder, the one who's the mouthpiece, and they have such a love of writers and wanted to create something. This is around the time of COVID, but wanted to create something where writers get paid for their written work. And so
Right.
people can subscribe. There are options to read everything you want on Substack for free, but certain ones you have to subscribe to. And there are levels of subscribing. If
Right. It's
it's
like
like,
Patreon, similar
yeah,
idea to Patreon,
yeah,
but
yeah.
more
And
written.
there's a right. So Substack, I think that there's a wealth of opportunities there, and also getting paid for your content. Like that's nice. You do have to get people on board though. You have to get people interested enough to pay to see it, to read
Right. So
your.
you've got to choose. You've got to decide, okay, I'm going to go all in on Substack. I'm going to go all in. Like, you can't spread yourself too thin in terms of like the effort that you're going to put in across all of these like ideas that we put out there. Um, I've seen people going all in on, getting people to subscribe to their Patreon channel, which is, someone I know who's a podcaster. He started out he probably also launched his podcast during COVID. And then he realized it was taking up a lot of his time and he really
Yeah.
needed it funded. So he opened up a
Yes.
Patreon. So Patreon basically is you can support someone's efforts in this podcast for, different amounts of money are going to like get you access to different things. I think it's an absolutely brilliant idea. And like you said before, if your podcast has low overheads, then great. But if you find that it is actually taking up a lot of your time and you've grown the audience, and I think God, everyone should get to that stage, then Patreon, you can just offer, like this guy, he would offer kind of like a meet and greet on a live YouTube every Thursday if you were a
Right.
Patreon
Right.
subscriber.
Right. So so he does monetize his podcast through Patreon? Is that what you said? Okay, because I do know people who have told me on that they've done not so much Patreon, but other places where they're just not able to get enough donors, patrons that may reach the goal of what they would like to fund their podcast.
Yeah.
But it is something to try, and it requires more spreading of the word so that people, and yes, bring out something enticing so that people will get interested. In the
I think that's
podcast.
been really a theme of, it's a lot of what I talk about in coaching, is that you can have all of these. I saw a video about it yesterday about doing the thing, and he's like, talking about doing the thing isn't doing the thing, and writing about doing the thing also isn't doing the thing, and planning time in your diary also isn't doing the thing. Doing the thing is doing the thing. And
Right.
that's the theme that runs out through all of these ideas that we have of what we're going to do next. It's like you can make all the pretty Trello boards and even put out the accountability posts and join the accountability. But at the end of the day, if you don't sit down and record those episodes and then go out
Right.
and talk and network and tell people that it exists,
Right.
it won't grow. You have
Yep.
to be willing to network and talk
Right.
about the thing ad nauseum.
Right. Right. So with that, I should remind people that the title that we agreed on was how to get it done in under 30 days.
Oh,
And
in under 30 days, yes.
it can get done in under 30 days. Um, and there isn't necessarily a timeline of get this done by day number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm just saying the whole process can be done. It's more of it's more of a process, but the process can get done in under 30 days. But some people are like, oh, I don't need to get done. I can, if I get it done, in 2 months, that's fine, and that's also fine. I'm just saying I've done it more than once, where from inception to getting that first episode taped and ready to go, recorded and ready to go, it can take less than 30 days. Now, in my case, I have a huge broadcasting history behind me. So I know how to I know how to conceive and develop a show, book guests, interview guests, record. I outsource my editing because as you can tell from even just saying the sentence, I tend to stammer a little bit. I want to clean up what I'm saying, and I have many guests, so I need to clean up what they're saying because there's stammering or ums and ahs. Or the nice thing about recording is that if you don't like where a sentence of yours is going, stop what you're saying, and then the editor, even if the editor is you, can just do a nice edit and have a cleaner sound. But anyway, it can be done where it's all done in 30 days. So that's a thing that if somebody is interested in getting it done quickly or just getting it done, again, I'm happy to do a discovery call with you. If you want to meet a 30-day deadline, certainly we have several weeks ahead of us over the summer. People do want to take a summer break, summer getaway. Hopefully, with the security situation in the country, hopefully people can get a getaway. But they just want to get it done before Rosh Hashanah, because once you have the month of Tishrei,
Just time out. We have
yeah,
people that are not necessarily Jewish, people that are not living in
no
Israel.
problem,
So,
no problem. Right, sure. So for what it is, there's always a break in the schedule. You could just call it back to school time. So once it's back to
yeah.
school time, there are people who are like, I'm going to be so absorbed with that. The initial stages, I just want to get this done and on the air so that if I'm able to, if it is like a pre-recorded podcast, that I'm able to pre-record some episodes so that once the school year has started, I can at least upload on a weekly basis, or if it's a monthly podcast, I can upload on a monthly basis the next episode.
And I mean, I know you don't necessarily want to get bogged down in tech, but I'm sure people would love to hear what is there a super easy software to use to get that done? Like an app or whatever?
Um, that
I know that Spotify has one.
Spotify is a fantastic platform and so user friendly. You know what? If somebody wants to explore that question with me, the reason why I'm hesitant is because there's different kinds of podcasts out there. If someone wants to roll it out on a daily basis, weekly, monthly, yeah, I'd have to get back to you on that. And also, I'd also have to ask my senior producer if he would also recommend the one that we're using, because there used to be some technical glitches in it, but we're good to go now.
So like your summary of producing, promoting, and launching in 30 days, what would be the soundbite for that?
What would be the takeaway?
Yeah.
That it can be done. So I think that if you know the steps that are the evolutionary steps of what needs to get done, just like you're planning anything. And all of us are basically over the age of 15. We all basically know how to plan something. So in a way, it's part of doing the thing. Because you don't want to just wing it and like, I'm just going to start recording. I just need to start recording. Sometimes no, you need to have a plan. So it might mean doing some market research. The podcast that you're passionate about doing, are you just one of hundreds of that type of a podcast? How are you going to make yours stand out? Especially if you don't have a following now. how are you going to niche it enough that you will have an audience? It's maybe not something that's necessarily been done. So again, there is planning that you can do and along the way. And there are people like myself who can also help you plan and strategize the different steps that you need to do. So it can get done in less than 30 days. But you need to make a plan, just like anything. You know, if a person is going on a diet, or if they are planning to run a marathon or something, you have to have a plan of action.
Yeah.
You want to go to medical school, you have to have a plan of action. You don't just say, "Hi, I'm ready to be a doctor." I mean, you have to start your plan of action in high school.
Right. Yeah, and it kind of like, you know, on one hand it sounds obvious, but on the other hand it isn't, because, you know, a lot of people that I've spoken to about, they're like, well, yeah, I downloaded the software and I played around with it and I made a graphic. Like, they're starting in completely the wrong place. They're starting with like the fun stuff where you get to like mess around in Canva and play with the app. No, you have to start with what we call the bit more of the boring stuff, which is do the research. Start with the research. Is this even something that people are going to care about? Is this something that people are talking about? For sure, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm aware of the time. I'm gonna wrap
I don't think
up.
it's boring, by the way. I don't think it's boring. I think if it's a topic you're passionate
that's just my British. It's just my British sense of humor. When I talk about doing the boring stuff,
right? It's necessary.
It's the necessary stuff. If anyone has any questions, now is your time to unmute yourself. Otherwise, let's see. Is anyone unmuting? Any questions? Kim is unmuted, but maybe that's just a mistake. All right, so Heather, tell everyone that is live and on the replay where they can find you if they want to set up a call with you.
Yes, so I have a website called heatherdeanproductions.com. It's one word, heatherdeanproductions.com. My email address is info@heatherdeanproductions.com if you want to reach out about consulting, or if you just published a book that you think is a good fit for my podcast audience. So then you can also reach out there and fill out a guest contact application form. Same thing if you want to book a strategy session. The podcast that I host is 613 Books Podcast, which is wherever podcast platforms are. So if you are a voracious reader of books with authentic Torah values, you are welcome to join us there also. And I also just want to give a plug to, so this is something that's going to be very Jewish, but I also facilitate a free group called 10 Minutes to Shabbat. And that is a early candlelighting group. So there's a Jewish idea of you can amass a lot of credit, zuchusim. It's a big plus too if you are working on your time management skills regarding Shabbat, and you're thinking of, I aim to light my Shabbat candles early. I can give you more information about that as well. Our group 10 Minutes to Shabbat, where we even have a weekly raffle for people who manage to light their candles 10 minutes early the previous Shabbat. And also, I put out a weekly email with different tips about time management and planning your meals and just other kinds of inspiration regarding Shabbat. So that's also something I'm passionate about too.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone who came. This has been awesome.
Thank you for the opportunity.
All right.
I love what you do. I love your enthusiasm.
Oh, thank you. Awesome. Thank you, ladies. Everyone have a good